In 1984, a battle was going on between striking mine workers and Margaret Thatcher's Conservative government. A small group of LGBT people in London came together to support the workers in a way which, unknown to them at the time, would bring both communities together in ways which would change them and the country forever. This is working class history. This is the first in a 3-part miniseries about Lesbians and Gays Support the Miners, LGSM, a group which was set up to support miners in Britain during the Great Strike of 1984-5. Now, if you're not familiar with what the miners' strike was about, we're going to go into a lot more detail about this in a future episode. But in short, coal mining in the UK was a nationalised industry run by the National Coal Board headed by Ian McGregor. And miners were the best organised and most powerful group of workers in the country. And they'd brought down the Conservative government in 1974. So to break the workers' movement, the government planned to close pits en masse, essentially to destroy the industry and with it the National Union of Mine Workers, the NUM, whose president was Arthur Scargill. So an all-out strike broke out against the closure plan in March 1984, which the government had prepared for. So their strategy was, along with massive violent repression by the police, to basically wait it out until the miners were starved back to work. So raising money to support mining communities to help them hold out was a key part of the struggle. LGSM was formed by a small number of young people, initially in London, but it later spread around the country and raised huge amounts of money for miners and their families. And this is their story. Mike Jackson was one of the founders of the group. I should say that the audio quality at the start of this conversation isn't that great because Mike was in the pub, but it does get better shortly.
Yeah, I was born in a little working class town in Lancashire called Accrington, which when I was a little boy, I was born in 1954. When I was a little boy, it was still a thriving industrial town. And of course, the working classes had made great gains in the 60s and 70s. So there was a real spirit about the town. I mean, I've only got childhood memories of it, but, I remember kind of the blokes being excited on Thursdays because Thursdays tended to be payday and, working class people were starting to have money. I left Accrington and moved to become a student at Kew Gardens in 1973. Of course, that bringing me to London, which is where I came out. And so I've been in London for, 11 years before the miners' strike. I was having a little period of unemployment and, I've got some time on my hands. The government had this scheme on at the time, so it was like an enterprise allowance, so I could do bits of work and they give you 40 quid. So I was scraping by, basically. And then, of course, LGSM happened.
We were also very happy to be able to speak to Brett and Martin, who were also heavily involved in LGSM.
Okay, yeah, my name is Brett Harron. And my name is Martin Goodsell. I had not long moved to London. Well, I'd moved to London at the end of 1982, and I was working in London. I had just started a job working for the London Borough of Hackney. I was working as a residential social worker in a residential home for adults with learning difficulties. That was my first proper full-time job, I guess. I wasn't from London originally. I grew up in the north of England, in Oldham, just outside Manchester. So coming to London really, for me, was a bit of an eye-opener. I was very excited to be living in London, and it really was a big turning point for me in my life. I had just met Martin in 1983, just the year before. Came along to some meetings of what was called the Gay Young Socialists, which was a self-organised and not officially recognised group of lesbian and gay members of what was then known as the Labour Party Young Socialists. I wanted to go to that group because I wanted to meet more lesbian and gay people in London. I went along in 1983 and that's where I met Martin. And in fact, that year we then became a couple. Yeah, I'm from London, born and bred. When I first met Brett, I was working in the antiques trade. I was in a bijou antique shop on just near Bond Street, Burlington Arcade. And yeah, that was when we first met. So living and working in London, yeah. And as Brett said, we met through the Gay Young Socialist group. I was one of the founders of the organisation, and It was a group that ran for about a year and folded just before the miners' strike. We dissolved the group. But lots of the activists, mostly younger activists, who went on to become involved in Lesbians and Gay Support the Miners, LGSM, were actually members of the Gay Young Socialist Group. So, yeah, we met there, and that was 35 years ago, and we've been together ever since. So we were both active in the Labour Party, and for me, I was involved in other political organisations too, which I'll probably tell you a bit about later. So living and working in London as two young gay men, basically. Yeah, we were both at that time, in early 1984, we were both 24, just about coming up to 25. So we were still quite young.
This isn't just a story about LGSM, but about the relationships they forged together with the mining communities in the Welsh valleys. This is Sian James, the wife of a mine worker who, like many women, was deeply involved in supporting the strike, as we discuss in our episode 13, which is about women in the miners' strike. Sian was much later elected as a local Labour MP.
I'm still married to Martin, who was employed underground during the miners' strike. He wasn't actually a miner, but he worked underground. He was a fitter underground. And they were all members of the NUM. So when the strike was called, we fully supported the strike and we got involved with everything that happened during the strike. All of our grandparents, I had a grandfather who was a railway man and he had farming ancestors, but everybody else, if you trace this back, my husband and I, for years and years, generations, it would be mining. I was a young mother. I had 2 children. I had a little boy of 7.5 when the strike started and a little girl of 4.5. And they were as big a part of the strike as anybody else, really. So we were on strike from the beginning as a family. Very happy family, very content with our lives, very content as a housewife. I'd always been encouraged to speak up in the community and things. But I was very much involved in my children's school, in getting them involved in their music classes, in going to chapel, etc. So very much a community-based life.
Life at the time for LGBTQ people in the UK was particularly hard, and institutional and overt homophobia and discrimination was rife.
Well, there was certainly no such thing as equality as we would understand it at that time. Male homosexuality had only been decriminalised less than 20 years previously in 1967. And even then, the age of consent for gay men was set at 21, whereas the age of consent for heterosexuals was 16. There were no formal legal protections from discrimination for lesbian and gay people in terms of employment rights, housing, provision of services, and certainly no legal recognition of lesbian and gay relationships, e.g. marriage. My recollection and experience was that life for most gay men and lesbians at that time was very closeted, certainly outside the big cities such as London, Manchester and Birmingham. Where there was, in fact, a growing lesbian and gay scene, but nevertheless, for an awful lot of lesbian and gay men, I'm guessing their lives were still quite closeted. At that time, I mean, the term LGBT didn't exist really in any way, as far as I can recall. People did say very commonly the gay community or the lesbian and gay community, whereas now, obviously, people are more used to talking about LGBT, LGBTI, LGBTQ+, or whatever. It was really just used to say the lesbian and gay community or the gay community, which was a reflection really of where we were in terms of the political situation at that time. Homophobia was fairly casual and overt. That was quite commonplace. The right-wing tabloid newspapers were full of anti-gay stories, which increased in viciousness as emerging details about HIV and AIDS became more widespread. The Tory government at the time were quite strident in their attacks on lesbians and gay people, usually citing support for lesbian and gay rights by left-wing Labour councils as evidence of the depravity and unfitness to govern of the loony left, as they called it. The police would routinely harass lesbian and gay people. Raids on gay bars and clubs were not uncommon. Gay men were often harassed and even arrested for kissing another man in the street. You could be arrested for kissing your boyfriend. This was, I don't believe that was necessarily particularly a criminal offence per se, but the police would use things like, offending public decency or outraging public decency just as a way of harassing gay people.
For Martin in London, where there was a much bigger and more visible gay community, things weren't as bad.
I think for me, I'll talk about the personal side. Having lived in London all of my life, I was, I suppose, one of the lucky ones. I never felt particularly ashamed of being gay, quite the opposite, actually. And I had relationships fairly early on as a teenager. And where I lived in West London, it was very close to Earl's Courts. There were always gay people around. And lots, more than now actually, lots of bars to go to, particularly around the Earl's Court area. So, yeah, I mean, I was out and about as a young gay person from fairly early teens, I suppose, in some ways. It was quite easy to get into pubs when you were 16 years old at that time. So on a daily basis, as long as you weren't openly gay, I suppose, you could live a fairly gay life. It was under the radar. You couldn't be out to everybody, but, you could lead a fairly reasonable life within limits. I worked at, I had Saturday jobs and worked in clothes shops around Kings Road, Kensington Market. And there were always lots of gay people around. So I think it depended where you worked and what you were doing. But it felt at the time quite an exciting place to be living in London at that particular point. That's not to say life wasn't tough for other people. I can remember reading in the local paper where anyone caught cottaging or hanging around Brompton Cemetery at the time, their names and addresses would be published in the local newspapers. So it's incredibly vindictive. There was bullying at school, but also it was a time of, there was a lot of excitement around fashion and music. It was a time of glam rock and androgyny and Ziggy Stardust, Mark Boland. So there was times, it felt like times were changing. It was quite exciting on some levels. I think London obviously was a very, very different ball game. And as Martin said, lots of things were happening, and obviously a lot of people could live a life under the radar, if you like. But growing up in the north of England, certainly my experience was very, very different. So it didn't feel it was particularly easy to live an openly gay life, and I couldn't wait to leave university and come down to London, as I guess was the same trajectory for an awful lot of people. But like Martin said, well, although I said at the beginning that legally there were lots of issues, lots of problems, it wasn't always easy for people to be openly gay. There was, at the same time, in the early 80s, early mid 80s, there was a coming to the fore of lesbian and gay issues, certainly politically. A lot of left-wing Labour councils up and down the country, particularly in London, Ken Livingstone's Greater London Council, were starting to actively and very positively take up lesbian and gay issues in a way that hadn't really happened before. And this was something really quite exciting for me and for Martin and people like ourselves, because all of a sudden someone was actually making a noise, saying that actually these were issues which were politically important, and were giving voice to lesbian and gay people in a way that we hadn't really experienced previously. I mean, that was a source of great tension and conflict with Margaret Thatcher's Tory government. As I said, they took a very strident tone about lesbian and gay issues. And so people like Ken Livingstone and the leaders of other I guess principally in London Labour councils, but also in places like Manchester and Liverpool, these people became targets for attack by the government and by their friends and allies in the right-wing, particularly tabloid press. It was also a time when within trade unions, lesbian and gay issues have started to gather something of a momentum. I mean, issues were starting to be talked about by trade unionists and being raised by lesbian and gay trade unionists, and self-organised groups within trade unions were starting to be formed. I was a member of what was then called NALGO, one of the principal local government unions, which subsequently became Unison. And I got involved in a group called NALGAY, which was for lesbian and gay members of NALGO. So although the wider political climate on lots of levels didn't seem particularly propitious, there was an awful lot of political activity that was starting to bubble up and starting to gather momentum.
The fact that homophobia was just everywhere made many gay people internalise those feelings, including Mike.
Bearing in mind the 1967 Offences Act happened when I was 13 years old, so I was already, I don't know where puberty and adolescence converged, but I was certainly, I had sexual feelings, and they were always homosexual feelings. And working class background, no kind of liberal education or whatever, liberal values. I'd absorbed the mad, the sad, and the bad about my own sexuality, and I internalised it. And that was not good. It made me a bit of a miserable teenager at times, a very frightened teenager, because I'd been brought up to be an honest lad, but I knew I was lying about something about myself, and I didn't like that. But I hadn't any. There were absolutely no means whatsoever. There were no role models. There was no counselling services. Nothing. And in fact, I went to my GP, I think, 2 or 3 times to try and, look for a cure for it. But thankfully, I was so paranoid that by the time I actually got into the consulting room, the GP, I would sit there and go, I've got a cold. And thank God I did that, because, back in the day, who knows? I could have been sent for ECT, electroconvulsive therapy. Awful. So I used to, as a teenager, I used to go cottaging, which is having sex with men in public toilets. I was underage, and although I was proactively going out seeking this, I look back and think these men were paedophiles, really having sex with a teenage boy. And I always felt very grubby after I'd had these kind of experiences. Used to come home and bathe myself to kind of somehow clean the homosexuality out of myself. And then I came out, and literally I came out as a result of phoning Gay Switchboard. It would have been several phone calls. I'm sure I would have argued with them saying, I know you don't think there's anything wrong with homosexuality, but I do. And then eventually I think the penny would have dropped, and I would have gone, actually, maybe there isn't anything wrong with it. And then it was like an explosion. I went from 0 miles an hour to 110 miles an hour. And so they referred me to a, what would you call it? It was a gay disco, but it was put on by a Roman Catholic priest, believe it or not. And so it was a bit sheltered. It was like a safe space. And it was in a church hall, no alcohol, a dance set in the corner where somebody was playing 45 RPM vinyls. And although I'd had sex with men, this handsome young man, more my age, came up to me, and these were the days when people asked you for a dance. And this young man came up to me and said, would you like a dance? And we danced. And I think we hugged. We may even I think we kissed as well. And at that moment, as we were kissing in front of other people for everyone to see, all the scales of self-oppression just fell off me. It was like an onion just unfolding. Because tongues down throat, I just thought, nobody can tell me this isn't normal. This is what I've been longing for. Yeah. And, I didn't go home with him, never saw him again, didn't have sex with him. But somehow that public exposure of me expressing myself just changed everything. Yeah. Because I finally realised this is natural. There isn't nothing abnormal about this. This is me. This is who I am. And I'm surrounded by other young LGBT people, who are also going through the same thing.
Meanwhile, in Wales, things had been hard for a while, and they were getting harder, and people knew that conflict with the government was coming.
So we were members of the Neath Life and Upper Swansea Valley Miner Support Group, and that covered three distinct top ends of three valleys in the South Wales coalfield. The colliery my husband worked in, Abernant, was an anthracite coalfield. And we knew lots of people who had family who had emigrated to America, to go and work in the big anthracite coalfields in Pennsylvania, etc. And although we'd seen the contraction of the mining industry and we'd seen bits close, everybody, in a sense, people who had stuck it out or who were still working underground, were very supportive of Arthur Scargill, felt very passionately when the strike began that what we were fighting for was the dignity of work, because we'd also come through 5 years of Thatcherism. Since Thatcher had been elected in 1979, we'd known then that things were going to be difficult. We knew that she was no lover of trade unions. We knew that she didn't believe in nationalised industries. And she was also hell-bent on tackling those unions that she'd seen who had brought down previous Conservative governments. So we knew, that we were on a collision course. And as a part of that collision, we knew that our communities had been getting poorer. And by poorer, I mean less and less facilities, less and less opportunity, less and less traditional jobs. Jobs in mining had contracted, in the docks had contracted, along the railways, the steelworks. So we were an area that was very dependent at that time on heavy industry, traditional heavy industry. So all the things that created those communities, like the trade union, the miners' welfare halls, the social clubs, the very fabric of our society all revolved around the Labour Party, the anti-apartheid movement, the CND movement. So most of our friends came from that background, working class background, but working class very much focused on that life was very difficult for a lot of people, and that this had been really compounded by, trickle-down economics, by the Reagan-Thatcher years, and our fear of nuclear war.
When the strike began, many people thought, like the previous nationwide miners' strikes in 1972 and 1974, that the miners would just win quickly. And some people also questioned why fighting Margaret Thatcher was just falling on mining communities.
So, by this point, at first, everybody said, not us as miners' families, but the local community were all saying things like, give the miners 6 weeks, they've broken Conservative governments in the past, and they've given in, so it'll take about 6 weeks. And I remember thinking to myself, well, why are they expecting us to struggle on, and why are they expecting us to fight the battle? Unless we all combine against Margaret Thatcher and her government. And it was a repressive government. It was a government that wasn't talking about the sort of communities we wanted to live in. And I thought that was pretty unfair. And we had discussed it as a family, as a young family, and we knew that it was a long haul. So what was happening at this point was that the strike was hardening, people getting more and more determined. So we'd got from March through to about the July, August, and it was starting to dawn on us that it was going to be far longer than a quick strike like I'd seen with my father in the past and we'd seen in 82. Martin was working underground, and we were pretty much entrenched. But what was happening is, as sort of like fighting back against this, was that Ian McGregor was saying things like, don't support the miners, you're paying for violence, you're supporting Arthur Scargill and his flying pickets. And we were saying, no, you're not. You're supporting hard-pressed communities. You're providing food and support for miners and their families. You're not paying for those sorts of things. The union was getting ever deeper into financial difficulty, because one of the ways that the government was pushing back was, mass arrests at pickets, reading the Riot Act, illegal assembly and things like this. People were, men in particular, were being arrested on picket lines, then they were being banned from every picket line in the country. And if they broke that ban, that would mean that the union would forfeit the bond or the bail that they'd set up, And obviously they were running up bills with legal defences, etc. So at this point, everybody was getting pretty entrenched, and everybody knew it was going to be a longer haul than we'd imagined.
As it became clear the strike was going to be a long, drawn-out dispute, the idea for LGSM was sparked.
It's well documented, really, how LGSM came about, because I'd volunteered to become a member of Lesbian and Gay Switchboards, as it was called then, which, was a counselling service for isolated gay people. And I benefited from their service, by the way. That's how I came out. I was a very unhappy, depressed teenager. Nobody talked about sexuality, let alone homosexuality, and I'd absorbed all the kind of homophobic nonsense that was around me at the time. And so I felt a great, debt of gratitude to Gay Switchboard. So, X years later, I actually became a volunteer. And the person who interviewed me to become a volunteer on Gay Switchboard was Mark Ashton. And I immediately, took a shine to him. He was he's very kind of a charismatic young man, and was recruited. And of course, that meant that I met Mark whilst I was doing kind of my shifts on Gay Switchboard, and then we would meet outside of that, because we became great friends, because we shared two things in common. One, being activist gay men. Two, both being socialists. Mark Ashton, his background, he was born in Oldham in Lancashire and grew up in Northern Ireland, because his father had a kind of job where he had to travel quite a bit. And he was growing up in Northern Ireland. He'd got a gay friend, a very close friend of his, called Monty, Robert Montgomery, who later did become part of LGSM. But he wasn't particularly political at all, Mark. He was quite feisty. He stood up for himself, but the political stuff hadn't really happened for him. But his father had this job installing second-hand textile machinery. So as, the British mills were updating their equipment, from what I can gather, he'd get hold of these looms and bits of equipment and install them overseas. And he was working, I believe, in Pakistan, or it could have been Bangladesh. And he invited Mark over to go and stay with him. And that experience really changed Mark. Mark saw poverty in a way that he'd never witnessed in Britain. And apparently he came back quite a changed man, a little bit more serious about life and so forth. And that kind of political flame had been lit as a result of that experience. And he becomes a member of the Communist Party, and towards the end of his life, he actually became the first ever out gay General Secretary of the Young Communist League. So, in a sense, by the time I met Mark, he was already well down that path and was a lot more kind of what you might call politically educated and aware than I was. That's such as the penalty for not being aligned to a political party. I didn't enjoy the kind of political education that he'd had, and he put a lot of work into it. He was very knowledgeable about kind of socialist politics, and so by the time the miners' strike happened, it was a good 2-3 months into the miners' strike. I bumped into Mark one day in King's Cross, where I lived then and still do to this day. And Mark said, "Hi, Mike, how do you fancy taking some buckets and collecting for the miners at the Gay Pride March this Saturday?" So this is 1984. And I said, "Yeah, good idea." And that's how it all started, really. It was as simple as that. after the Pride March, there was a rally in ULU, which was the London University Students' Union, and another organisation, the Labour Campaign for Lesbian and Gay Rights, had already organised a meeting there to support the miners, and they got a young Kent miner to come up to speak at the meeting. So naturally, Mark and I went to this, and it was packed. It was standing room only, and the miner got a very good reception from people. There was another collection, I believe, and Mark just said, "We're on to something here." So he set up a meeting held in his flat in the Haygate estate in South London. And we had the very first meeting on the 11th of July 1984 in his flat, and 11 people came to that. And they were mainly people from what you might call political backgrounds, but not all. There were people who were fairly new to politics. And people like me, I was never one for party politics. So, I wasn't like a kind of Trot or a Stalinist or a Communist or a Labour Party member at that stage. I was unaligned. And that's how LGSM started.
Given all the discrimination against LGBT people, Mike and Mark felt it was important that they had an explicitly lesbian and gay organisation.
So it's 1984. We'd had gay liberation for 14, 15 years in its various guises. We still didn't have any rights whatsoever. And in fact, although the 1967 Sexual Offences Act decriminalised homosexuality, the arrests of gay men shot up dramatically after that act was passed. Okay, so it's no longer criminal to be a homosexual, but what the police were doing was that they were entrapping gay men, and they were using soliciting, importuning and gross indecency as ways to oppress gay men. And when I talk about entrapping them, they would dress up young, cute officers in ripped jeans and leather jackets, and they would go into public toilets, and they would entrap gay men. Totally illegal, of course, yeah, and terribly unfair. So the movement, had a lot still to be fighting for. And so one did things as a gay man, as an out proud gay man, because that visibility and that statement was so important. So, Mark and I were working as volunteers on Gay Switchboard. So that was kind of the gay thing that we were doing. The miners' strike, however, was such a huge thing. I mean, it's the biggest industrial struggle since the 1926 miners' strike. And it completely divided the country. And so it drew in all kinds of people. And so quite naturally, as socialists or communists, Mark and I and the other people who later joined LGSM, naturally wanted to support the miners. We'd want to do that together as gay men, because that's how we wanted to do it, because that was part of that continuum of finding it necessary to assert yourself and to be out. So whilst we could have worked within the labour and trade union movement just as individuals, people like us felt it was a necessity to actually do that, but collectively as gay men, to, in a sense, to assert ourselves, really. And that appealed to me and Mark and probably every other person who joined LGSM, because it meant asserting ourselves within the labour and trade union movement. There were instances within the labour and trade union movement where homosexuality was dismissed or scathed or whatever. Back in the 70s, during the 70s miners' strikes, there was some of the leading lights of the Gay Liberation Front then went on a miners' support march, and I don't know whether they were holding hands or whatever, but they actually got mocked by some of the striking miners. And that's the way it is. So that's why it was important for us to collectively be together to support the miners, but united together as out proud gay people. We were doing that every day of our lives. Mark and I were volunteers on the switchboard. We were challenging homophobia wherever we came across it. And working class people were just as capable of being homophobic and working class men as anybody else were. But the point is to challenge it, to change hearts and minds, which is what we were used to. In a sense, when we started LGSM, we anticipated that we would have to be dealing with homophobia within the mining communities. Why not? It exists everywhere else around us. But we were prepared to challenge it. We certainly didn't support the miners with any sense of mutual exchange. We were prepared, unqualified, to support them in their struggle. And if we encountered individual instances of homophobia, we would deal with it, but we weren't doing it, trading off us supporting them for them supporting gay rights. We weren't as naive as that, yeah. What actually happened, though, was actually quite surprising for all of us because we didn't encounter any homophobia at all. I mean, when I met straight men who never really met out gay men back then, time after time after time, they would say, well, the thing is, I've never met an out gay man before. For sure they'd met closeted gay men or suspected certain men were gay or whatever. But being out was a very different thing. And we knew that. We knew politically it was just so important to be out at every possible opportunity, asserting your sexuality. And, if it would lead to discussions, great. And I've certainly had more than one experience where in that moment when I've met a stranger, a heterosexual man who's never met an out gay man before, and I've talked about it and they've wanted to listen, they've actually apologised to me for their kind of homophobic transgressions of people that I've never met in my life before, and it was all in the past, and it made me smile, that, because all I want is for them to, wise up and learn that it's okay for people to be gay, So that was something I was quite used to. And when we went into the mining communities, that's what we were kind of prepared for. But in fact, as I said, that actually never happened.
As the strike drew on, various organisations started twinning with the Valley's miners' support groups, and one day they got a letter from a new group they hadn't heard of before. And while they didn't know it yet, it would end up changing many of their lives and contributing in no small way to changing Britain.
So at this point, we decided that one of the ways that we would push back as a support group was that we would invite anybody who donated money to us, mainly groups, trade union groups, groups from overseas, activists, whatever. We would invite them to come and see where their money was being spent. So we would say, come and see, the Neath licensed Swansea Valley, come and see what we believe in, what we're struggling for, what these communities and why they're so precious to us are. And you'll actually see where your money is being spent. Now, not everybody picked up on that opportunity, but that started to broaden our horizons very much as well. Because if you got involved with hosting visitors, you met really interesting people. You got to have very interesting discussions. We hosted journalists from Switzerland, journalists from America, trade unionists from other countries, Belgium, France, Scandinavia, etc. And more to the point, trade unionists from other parts of Britain, where we'd had very, very little to do with them. And, the big unions, the big donors were people like Sogat and the big print unions, the Daily Express chapters. So there was an awful lot of people who were supporting us who hadn't really, many of them came from working class backgrounds and had family who'd been in working underground. A lot of them had made their lives in London, Manchester, Birmingham, etc. But we hadn't been exposed to people from those communities. We're pretty insular in a way. We didn't travel greatly, and you had your 2 weeks miners fortnight, and you ended up going to places like Porthcawl, Barry, Aberystwyth, or day trips to various holiday beach places. So this was opening up a very different world for us. And we really got involved with it because we really liked to hear from the people that were supporting us. We really liked showing them around. And we met interesting people. So we were fully invested in this when they asked for volunteers. The second really important reason was you got an extra bag of food. And the weekly food bag runs, if you put 2 visitors up, you would get an extra bag of food to provide food for them. So, it was a quid pro quo in a way. But for us, the main driver was the fact that we were meeting activists and trade unionists from lots and lots of different backgrounds, BME backgrounds, and really it was fascinating to hear why they wanted to support us or how they felt as strongly as we did. So it was great to hear about their struggles. So for myself, and this is how I remember it, other people remember it in different ways, but we had a letter had come asking us to accept this money. And at this point, this is Lesbians and Gays Support the Miners, and people saying things like, what do you mean, London gays? No, lesbians and gays support the miners. So there's a little bit of, and then there was sort of like a really sort of strange little nervous laugh that went round, and people saying, what are you laughing at? And we said, no. And then there were lots of little jokes, typical working class jokes, or you'll all have to stand with your backs against the wall, or the men. And the other women just got really cross with this. We just thought, oh, for God's sake, we should be so far beyond this now. And that's the point where I spoke up and said, I don't care who people are. If they're giving us money and they've gone to the bother of collecting this money, we should just accept it. And we should do what we do with every other group that collects money for us and twins with us. They should be invited down to come and see where their money's being spent. And, there wasn't any great argument about that. There wasn't any dissension about that. People were pretty cool about it. And I think the sort of silliness, it didn't last like, a couple of minutes. And there was no overt, anti-gay, anti-lesbian feeling. It was just like, why do they want to do it? And the riposte was, well, we don't care why they want to do it. It's good enough for us that they want to raise money for us. And of course, the payback of that was that the LGSM became one of our most consistent funders and supported us right all the way through the strike.
Well, that's it for part 1. Our Patreon supporters can listen to all 3 parts now, as well as 2 bonus episodes. For everyone else, future episodes will be out each week. Next time, we'll be talking about the relationship forged between LGSM members and the mining communities. And in part 3, we'll be looking at the end of the strike and the massive legacy that LGSM left. Some of what we were told, unfortunately, we just couldn't fit into the episodes. So that's what we've put in the 2 bonus episodes for our Patreon supporters. We've also got more information, including photos and video, on our website, workingclasshistory.com, linked in the show notes. This miniseries is part of our wave of new episodes we're spending a lot more time on. As we've got no adverts or corporate sponsors, and we want all of our episodes to be available for everyone, we'll only be able to keep doing this if we get more support from you, our listeners, on Patreon. Patreon is a service which enables people to support us from as little as $2 a month, and in return get benefits like exclusive early access to episodes, bonus audio, access to our database of events and map under construction, our annual report, free and discounted merch, and more. So if you can, please consider supporting us at patreon.com/workingclasshistory. That's patreon.com/workingclasshistory. If you can't, that's totally cool too. But maybe you could do something like give us a review on your favourite podcast app or share our episodes on social media. Thanks to all of our existing Patreon supporters for making this podcast possible. This episode was edited by Jesse French. Theme music for this episode is by the Kellingly Colliery Brass Band. Catch you next time.